What's up, everybody? Welcome to our channel today, and welcome to this episode of Let's Talk About It. Kēvin and Karla are going to be finishing out this little mini-series on racism and kind of its specifics, and today they're going to be talking about how racism affects society. So remember, like this video, comment, share it, go ahead and subscribe to our channel if you haven't yet so that you don't miss a single video that we release here. Let's talk about it.
All right, here we are, and this has been a fun segment, 3 weeks of filming Let's Talk About It on this topic of racism.
Yeah.
Just a super quick recap. The first week we talked about racism as a Velcro sin and how everything sticks to it, and how even in candor, just how with Velcro, if things get into it, it loses its function.
Yeah.
And we can find that in obviously the human heart. The more sin comes in and just infiltrates and takes over, the less we are, quote, salty, in the earth.
Mm-hmm.
And then last week we talked about historically the church's complicity in racism, and really appreciating, Kēvin, your willingness to share your heart with us and your pain and your own reality, and which I think is very important. And you sharing how a lot of things that we as white people might grow tired in, it's your everyday life.
Mm-hmm.
I never go to a store and am followed by somebody.
Yeah.
I never, in fact, something came up recently where I was like, am I doing this just because, I've never questioned complaining at a store or making sure that my order was right, or marching up somewhere to make sure that I'm served how the establishment would say supposed to be served.
Mm-hmm.
I've never feared for my life running around my neighborhood in the dark. So really appreciate you sharing your heart with us.
Thank you.
So today we're going to talk about how racism infects society. And originally when we had this topic, it was like, is it supposed to be infect or affects? And I was like, no, I like this because it does infect just like a disease.
Right.
And it takes over and attaches itself to cells. And we're living in a pandemic of a virus. So maybe this is a good little illustration, but racism does infect society. I have a quote here from Dr. King that says this: the Black Revolution is much more than a struggle for the rights of Negroes. It is forcing America to face all its interrelated flaws: racism, poverty, militarism, and materialism. It is exposing evils that are deeply rooted in the whole structure of our society and suggests that radical reconstruction of society itself is the real issue to be faced.
That's great.
I think it's so challenging.
Yeah.
And then Jamar Tisby says this: as you study history and the structural systems that regulate our life together, the sad fact is you find more injustice, not less.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, I'm sorry, did I cut you?
No.
I think that clearly paints the background of this discussion in a way that relates to what you mentioned last week in saying, I think it was still Tisby actually. Racism. I think you said racism doesn't end; it just changes form.
Right.
Where, I think it's easy for people, or this is my thought. This is my guess is that people who say racism doesn't exist today, they're saying it because it doesn't look like what it looked like in history.
Exactly.
As they learned it. They don't see, walk down the street and see a black man hanging from a tree. Mm-hmm. They don't see a lot of what we used to see in history, which I think does beckon us to appreciate the progress that has been made for sure. I don't think, and my hope is that people who watch our videos are not looking and saying like, oh man, they just feel like we're still stuck. Like, no, that's not the case. We've been to and intentionally go to civil rights museums so that we can look back in history to learn more,
sure,
but then also to celebrate where we've come from. But we do that with a realistic and accurate portrayal of our present and a hope for our future that says we still have strides to make.
Yeah. Just because we're not, one of the more shocking and brilliant things about the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis that we both recently went to was when you first walk in, there's like a holding room, but you're standing right by an auction block. It's bronze and it's a statue, but it's an auction block of a woman and a baby being auctioned by a white man. You see a row of young black men that are chained together in the bowels of a slave ship. You then see, outfits from Africa, and then all these facts surrounding the transatlantic slave trade. And then you go in and watch a video, and then you enter the museum of just fact after fact after fact. And I think because we, exactly as you said, it's the short-sighted and honestly ignorant statement that racism doesn't exist because we no longer have chattel slavery, which are usually the same people who want to argue that biblical slavery and chattel slavery were the same thing, which they weren't. Indentured servitude, you worked yourself out of that, where chattel slavery is owning property, which was founded and perpetuated here in America in the settling of our country in the 1700s, or starting in the 1600s. So one of the things about racism is a Velcro sin that I heard on that podcast I mentioned.
Pause.
Yeah.
I just wanted to further that point a little
please
bit
further
more
it.
and say that even in the Bible, that is not God's way or thumbs up to slavery, saying that's perfectly okay. No, that was his way of mitigating it, realizing this is how wicked these people are. So let's put some parameters on it. And just like as last week's video discussed, like Jesus came in raising the bar even higher, saying, listen, you couldn't uphold that, but that's just pointing to your need for me.
Yeah.
So,
that's great. Yeah.
Clear.
Yeah. One of the weaknesses I have is I often feel like everybody's reading my mind, and like I don't have to, couch all the comments. So please.
How great would that be?
No.
Oh, well, it could be bad. Yeah.
Not great. I would never want my mind to be read. One of the things I mentioned this 3 weeks ago, the podcast where I heard racism's Velcro sin, is it put words to, or a quick phrase to define what I had been seeing in my research, and also a part of some of the passions that God has had a part of my life for a long time. But now I'm going to get to walk those out actually in a profession of outreach. But that racism in our country and in our region, let's say even in our area, it touches food distribution, women's health, voter suppression, redlining, poverty, the wealth gap, positions of power and influence. That was a list that I made just quickly when I was going through preparing for this segment. It has an impact and an influence on all of those areas. And as a Christian, our responsibility as a person with a transformed heart, as we continue to say in these segments, is to look around at our neighbor and say, hey, what can I do to help? It's not just that Jesus comes in and changes our attitude. Yes, it is inside out. This is some of the argument between what people want to pit of biblical justice and social justice. But I would say that biblical justice is actually a combination of both. It is the acknowledgement that the individual is transformed from the inside out, but that socially that transformed individual must say, I have to have an impact in this community that God has placed me in. If not, we would get saved and then just go right to heaven.
Right.
If not, it wouldn't matter where we lived. There wouldn't be a calling or an urge to change things. But even more importantly, or the basis of even change, is that we're called to love our neighbor. And what that looks like, it changes. That is our mission and our mode of operation. The platform of how we do that changes depending on, our age, where we are, what we do, education. You were a social worker. You have a master's degree. I'm a child development major with a degree in that. I couldn't go and do social work. So I think it's a recognition that the transformed heart has to have an impact in our society. And so that's the positive. I'll have an example that I find. I was going to use it last week, but I did forget, so I'm just going to use it this week. But the fact that racism impacts, it impacts all kinds of arenas in our world. This has to do with an education. This was a school. This is Bob Jones. He lived from 1883 to 1968. He was an evangelist in South Carolina, but he opened Bob Jones University. So he's an evangelist, mind you. He opens Bob Jones University. He had financial backing from the KKK. He preached to millions across the United States. By the 1920s, he was among the most famous evangelists in the country. He opens a university in 1927, private, Christian, all-white college that banned African-American students throughout Jones's lifetime. He died in 1968.
Wow.
Okay, so it's now a popular destination for conservative presidential candidates on the campaign trail. This university did not admit black students until 1971, and it banned interracial dating until a visit from a former president drew press coverage that forced the school to withdraw the policy in 2000.
Whoa.
So,
racism
infects society. When I went to the Equal Justice Initiative Memorial in Montgomery, Alabama this summer, a lot of and this is a sobering thing, and I don't say it with anything except the utmost respect for black people. I mean, just people. A lot of the screenshots or the pictures I took of the reasoning that people were lynched was to remind myself of the heinousness of man, the heart without God, and what we've done. And that is that many people were lynched if they were in an interracial relationship or if they were a clergyman who performed the ceremony.
Yeah.
Now, I'm married to a pastor. My oldest son is getting married here in, a few weeks. My oldest son is white, and he is marrying a biracial girl who has dark skin. My grandkids will have dark skin. If I step back in time into this time in history, Bob Jones did not allow interracial dating the majority of my lifetime.
Yeah.
That's disgusting. I mean, I'm trying to think of a nicer word, but it's sad, and racism infects society.
And that's the crazy thing about it, is because it's easy to look at the multiplication principle from our good standards. Where even that's a book that I know I've done a study with here at the church, and this is not condemning. What is the author?
Multiplication Challenge?
Yes.
Steve Murrow.
It's not condemning that at all. I'm just using the idea, the principle of multiplication, compound interest, math terms, just in general. But, if we look at disciples making disciples, many of us have probably heard the story of going to a funeral of a Christian man who discipled like 10 guys that all stood up. But then the question is asked, now, if you were discipled by these 10 guys who were discipled by the deceased man, stand up. And like 100 guys stood up.
Oh, yeah.
We see the multiplication principle saying, okay, this follower of Jesus had other people following him, and other people followed those men or women, and that is how discipleship works. Mm-hmm. Discipleship is not just a Christian term. It's not a Christian principle or idea. There's disciples of the KKK, where in this circumstance, you said Bob Jones was funded, and he had the financial backing from members of the KKK. That helped him to establish a university where now students are going through. I would be curious to look up the statistics and see how many students have they had since that university was founded. Mm-hmm. And not to say that every single student that passed through, just naturally adopted his beliefs, but how many of them did? That question is worthy of asking, because that's the way I think of racism today, where when someone does, the few times when I have conversations with someone who's asking that question or willing to listen, I'll say that, genuinely willing to listen, I propose that and say, how many people do you think exist on this earth, Christian or non-Christian, who have racism in their hearts? Not even on this earth, let's just say in America. And a number will be thrown out, and it's like, okay, how many of those people do you think have positions of leadership? You don't even have to narrow it specifically to law enforcement. Just how many are owners of businesses? How many are CEOs? How many are running banks? How many are teachers, professors, and or deans of a university, where they have reach, they have power that they're able to impose under their followers, under their students, under their clients, customers, and they're able to reach in a way where their beliefs, their ideals, their values are being passed on. They're not always being received, but they're being passed on or affecting other people. And that's what we're speaking to, is that it exists. It exists. So in 2000, I was 6 years old in 2000. But clearly, God, I chose Lauren to be my wife, but God knew. So if we had been born just years earlier, we met on the college campus at AU. That wouldn't have been allowed.
No, you wouldn't even been on that campus.
I wouldn't have been on the campus. That is crazy. So on this topic, I think of Jim Crow laws, because when I grew up in high school, I remember discussing Jim Crow. And granted, again, I did not enjoy history a whole lot. But to my memory, I don't recall getting into the details of Jim Crow laws. I remember the generic statement: laws were created to make it more difficult for African Americans to live. And that's all I really remember.
Right.
Not to diss my high school teachers if they're watching this, but that's all I really remember. But going to museums and doing a deeper dive, I came across this picture that I wish I could share, but I'll just read how it describes some of the Jim Crow laws, where for education, it says, separate schools shall be provided for white and colored children, and no child of either race shall be permitted to attend a school of the other race. You're speaking to that. Now, granted, this is, 50s, I guess, what would it be the years? As early as 30s up towards 50s and 60s. But still transpiring even to 2000. This is how it infects. Transportation. The conductor of each passenger train is authorized to assign each passenger to the car designated for their race. Businesses/institutions. No business shall serve food to white and colored people in the same room. We can't eat together. We can't enjoy a Chick-fil-A biscuit unless they are separated by a solid partition, a dividing wall of hostility, and a separate entrance is provided for each compartment. For marriage and relationships, the legislature shall never pass any law to legalize any marriage between any white person and a Negro or a descendant of a Negro. First of all, that vocabulary is ridiculous, where it's going so strong as to say a law shall never be passed. Not this law forbids it currently until something else has changed. We're forbidding a law from ever being passed. And then also we're describing white persons as persons, but black people as Negroes. They're less than a person. And then there's like each wall of Jim Crow laws would have like a random law that was passed where it's like, man, that doesn't even sound like it should exist, but it did. Yeah. So this one says, it shall be unlawful for a Negro and a white person to play together any game of pool or billiards. So looking at laws like that, things that the people white people who had power legislatively or whatever political power they had were enforcing these laws, saying this is how we're trying to set up our society. We've gotten rid of race or slavery. Okay, fine. Black people are considered citizens by the 14th Amendment. Fine. But we're still going to reach as far as we can into our society so that we can make our society look the way that we want it to. Where I remember one segment of the museum I came across where the vocabulary was also clear, talking about the Southern states in the Reconstruction era, saying how Southern states were opposing the federal mandates, where they were directly saying, I don't care if this is coming from our federal government. President can say what he wants. We're doing our own thing. And that's ridiculous. That's ridiculous because, one, we live in the South where it's like, okay, well, if we realize that just 70, 80 years ago, states were doing that this was the nature of society, the culture that was being built. These are the mandates that were being provided from state legislature and local county legislature. So if that was being imposed then, and that was the nature, that's how the sin of racism was affecting the hearts and passing through in lives during that time, how can we look today and say 70, 80 years, it's completely done away. How can we look and definitively say that there aren't individuals who still have power today, be it whatever their job, law enforcement, teachers, deans at an institution, restaurant owners, business owners? How can we look and say there are no individuals out there who are refuting to serve a person because of their skin? How can we look and say there are no law officers out there who are treating more harshly people of color because of their color? As much as those people try to say, oh, it's preposterous to think that exists today, I think it's more preposterous to think that people don't have sin in their hearts to where they are acting on it in that way.
Especially for the believer, the Christian, to somehow say that this could never be a part of someone's heart. I know I say it all the time, but I don't think they're reading their Bible and they're not preaching the gospel to themselves. I'm glad you made that point. Jim Crow was an answer to Jim Crow era was an answer to, let's make sure we keep the handle on this. And so it's not going to look like auction blocks. It's not going to look like lynching. Well, it's not going to look like, this, that, or the other. We're going to put these laws in place that, again, were a vice grip on our Black brothers and sisters. Yeah. I was reading an article this week from the Harvard Business Review, and it's obviously a secular article, but describing. I mean, as I read it, I thought, man, if the church could just do some of these principles. It was a CEO trying to, I have it right here, trying to move beyond diversity toward racial equity. So it's not just, if we take a picture of our company, then it's going to look diverse on the photo for the social media. It's actually, are there people of color in positions of influence? Are there people of color in positions of decision making? When this question really challenged me, if you have an organization that actually has racial equity, when someone like Trayvon Martin is murdered in the street, the next day your office should feel sad.
Yeah.
Your office should feel sobered and hurt. But if you're just people who don't have racial equity, then your Black brothers and sisters, or those that, might have some empathy, are going to have to mourn in silence. Yeah. Do you have conversations that cause stretching that makes you uncomfortable? Do you actually talk about the history of our country? Do you have trainings in place in the places where you work, where you go, that are teaching you the history of our nation that continues to influence? Because the irony of things like this is people who want to say, in their action, whether it's in their word or not, they say, I don't want to talk about this, are the very people who very much want to talk about the parts of history that they think are worth noting. Yeah. I've cotton in my mouth. Like cotton floating around in the room. So I find this challenging. I mean, it's worth seeing where people live, riding through southern towns. Why is the railroad track there? And on this side it looks this way, and that side it looks this way. Where abortion clinics were very, very strategically placed in communities to give easy access to someone to make a decision. And of course the individual makes the decision, but when you are strategic in going after a certain population of people, you're going to get a certain kind of result. Yeah. Food distribution, where there are food deserts, voter suppression, where there are places for people to go and access. I mean, we are currently in, a revote here in Georgia. Is the access to voting equal for all of us? Yeah. Poverty. I go back to positions of power and influence mainly because, in my life, I've said this before in some of our conversations, the Christian voices that came into my ears were all white until Priscilla Shirer. And now trying to, and of course there are less voices. There are less voices because there was less opportunity and less allowance for that voice. And even though I'm going to call sin, I also understand, because racism does infect society, I understand, because I'm going to speak up for my Black sisters. Even in this article from the Harvard Business Review, this gentleman, and I really admire his approach to how he has put an atmosphere of racial equity into his company. He's the CEO. he talks about how truly the Black woman is the one that has the hardest place to have a voice.
Yeah.
Woman, Black, always called, an angry woman. So I'm going to speak up for my Black sisters.
Yeah.
I understand why a Black woman would say, I want a choice of what to do with my body. If historically she had been, and hey, if you want to talk about this, come talk to me directly. Please don't blow up comment threads.
Yeah.
But I understand why.
Or screenshot.
Yeah, or screenshot and send it to your friends. A Black woman that forever had been told, lay there and let me take advantage of you. Have my children that we're going to have to hide in the back shed or in your outhouse, but you work for me. I own you. I understand generationally why a Black sister would say, I want to have a choice of what I'm going to do with my body. It's why I greatly respect and celebrate Kamala Harris's position as vice president-elect, because she is a Black woman in a line of all white vice presidents in history. Sure, her policies are things that as a believer, I cannot get behind because, like I said, I'll call sin, sin. But she is respectable, she has worked hard, and she's fought for the rights of women when I wasn't even allowed, and I keep using this one, to write my own check, to take out a loan, to be able to buy a house in the last century.
Yeah.
So I respect and will fight for my Black sisters, who I understand when racism has infected our society, it has greatly affected Black men and women. And we still see the result. We still very clearly see the results of those things in our nation.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I want to read that.
I can close us out
Okay.
With some challenges that I would give to our viewers. And also realizing that we have individuals watching who don't go to our church and who don't even live in our city. So I'll try to make it as general or generic as possible. But I'd encourage us all to think about, what is that part of town that we refuse to go down? We're like, it's not safe to go there. And before even putting our feet to the pedal to go there, just sit down and kind of brain map and think about why. Why do I feel like I can't go there, or I shouldn't go there, or I got to be extra careful going there? You're talking about safety, but what is it that portrays that area as unsafe? Is it what people say? Is it the statistics? Is it what is it where, if we really pull back and think about what's taking place in that area? For us here in Augusta, they call it the bottom. Like, it's the bottom, the downtown area, just that east boundary area. That's where the most crime happens, and so on. And so there's so many conversations around it, where ultimately what ends up happening is that we displace ourselves. We don't even step foot there anyway, but we completely displace ourselves to where we say we can't go there. Now we're thinking about the people who live there in such a light that says, man, they're dangerous. They really don't have enough intelligence for themselves to get out of that place, or to change the actions that surround the conversations regarding that place. So now we're not just looking at the location in and of itself, but now we're looking at the people group who lives there in a certain light. And now it influences the way we view that people group altogether.
Yeah.
And we're creating descriptions or labels. I like Pastor Brent's message from several weeks ago. We're creating labels for people who, one, wouldn't even label themselves that way.
Sure.
But also people who are in need, where not even talking about food as a food desert. Just to kind of hop on that trail a little bit, as you go, take a look and notice, take inventory of how many restaurants are there, but divide between fast food restaurants and restaurants that provide healthy foods. Consider that. And now think about that and how that contributes to the topic of hospitalizations, medical emergencies, welfare. All of that is contributing to the conversation, but it's all stemming from redlining. When redlining took place, it's saying this, once you pass this line, this demographic or these neighborhoods are not worthy of they're too high of a risk for us to invest money into. And so we're going to invest money into the other areas where now we're building up certain areas, but other areas are getting less financial support. So now the schools are less or less effective. They have a higher dropout rate. It's the conversation is all racism is a Velcro sin. It's all affecting in other pieces and places. So that's my challenge to us. Think about it. Where's that place that we don't want to go? Ask ourselves why 3 times. That's Pastor Adrian's thing. Why 3 times? Why do I not want to go? Why do I have that thought about why I don't want to go? And why do I have that thought about why I don't want to go? Ask yourself why 3 times. What is really surrounding it? And then actually going and taking inventory of what you see, because proximity will change your perspective to where you'll start to think from a different light and say, man, maybe these people are worthy of my time.
Yeah.
Maybe this location is worthy of my support. Maybe I'm a business owner and maybe I can actually build a business down here where I can actually help, where I'm not, as the cliche phrase goes, I'm not just, giving a man a fish, but I'm teaching them how to fish. I'm helping to change the wealth gap to where now we're building up the community because jobs are available.
Yeah.
Now we're decreasing the amount of crime that happens because jobs are available.
Love it.
Now we're decreasing the hypertension and medical diagnoses because we're providing food because there's a food desert. So now they don't have to only eat McDonald's. Now they can eat healthy foods. There's a lot more than
so good
what meets the eye. So
yeah.
I hope that you'll accept that. You can close us out.
Yeah. No, I love that. We're going to be people that go, the people that we love and that we live life with. We're all going to be going as people of God to go preach the gospel into our community, recognizing that our society has been greatly affected by history and racism is a Velcro sin. Things stick to it. So in particular for this conversation, we are going to be those that go and speak good news, that God loves people, that he has a solution to their every need. And we're excited about it. So see you next week. And I'm sure we'll have a lot to catch up on.
Yeah. Love y'all.
Bye.